Okay, we're speaking about a series of questions you've tabled for this coming sitting of Tynwald for the Environment Minister and for the Minister of Policy and Reform, all kind of building on similar themes, really, to do with conservation and the built environment. Tell us, first of all, what's prompted this series of questions, if you could.
Right, thank you, Dollin. I felt for a while that the world of built heritage and registered buildings and conservation areas has been quite silent. I think that's partly because we had a registered buildings officer. I was registered buildings officer, a conservation officer, for 10 years nearly. But we had a recent officer in that post, Ross Brasher, who was only in post for about a year and then went off to do other things. And he was doing a great job, but he was a lone voice, really. And I thought, with the climate change having been recognised by Tynwald and absolutely recognised unanimously that something's got to happen, I thought, there's a unique opportunity for agencies and departments of government to get their heads together, to take stock of where we are in terms of not just our existing built heritage, but how we can go forward and help owners of properties look at what they can do to contribute to, taking care of their buildings, but also having their input into climate change, positive measures. And so some of the questions are really trying to assess where we are at the moment, what's happened, and the programme for government also undertakes to do an audit of our built heritage by December 2020. And if that's going to happen, that really should have started quite a long time ago. But what I want to do is, in a positive way, to open this conversation and look at what we can do jointly to go forward.
Why now? You've mentioned the timescales to do with the audit. Is that the main reason for asking these questions at this sitting?
That's partly it, but I chair a group called the Building Conservation Forum, and that's made up, there are about 14 people who attend that meeting. We meet at least quarterly, and they're made up of people who have specialist interest, but also specialist experience in terms of our built environment. People such as Charles Gard, Edmund Southworth from Manx National Heritage, Peter Kelly, Tony Pass, a real mix of people who really have a passion for the built environment. But I'm also conscious our biosphere that we've undertaken to protect our built environment in there as well, and things have gone quiet. And I also think that where work has been undertaken by these specialists, but amateurs, we submitted a conservation area appraisal for Douglas Head. That's getting on for over a year ago. And everything has been silent now because the department doesn't have a registered buildings officer or a conservation officer who is in there really to properly assess these matters. And I'd like to open up the debate because it's not been discussed in a deep and meaningful way for quite a long time now.
So you're looking to tease out some of these answers through 5 questions. One of them's asking about how much the Environment Department has spent on the protection, conservation and enhancement of the island's historic built environment. So is there reason to believe perhaps that expenditure in that realm has diminished a bit, perhaps?
I'd be very interested to know what has been the expenditure, because there was Mr Cretney, who's a member of Legislative Council. He put a motion to Tynwald in 2017. He picked up a petition from Tynwald Day, and that was going forward to Tynwald for debate. And at that time, Minister Boot circulated a letter saying, this is being well looked after. We are looking after our built heritage. And at that time, they had just appointed Ross Brasher, as I've referred to. And he said, no, we're making headway with this. But in fact, that isn't the case. And we really need to, for our whole community, really take this more seriously. We can see our wonderful environment around us. And if you you see a lot of drone footage now. You can see the townscapes, the unique footprint that we have in our townscapes and in the countryside as well.
It's something that's championed, isn't it, about the Isle of Man, is pride in the built environment and in the natural environment, and how those two things work together, I suppose.
And visitors to our shores. I used to find when I was conservation officer, visitors who came here coming to new posts and looking for somewhere to live, they were absolutely astonished at the wealth and the variety. We've got such a wealth of Victorian architecture, late Georgian, vernacular buildings, and then you've got the wonderful arts and crafts. Now, if we don't really look after these buildings, they may be fine for our lifetimes, but they will become husks if we're not careful. They'll lose that richness because no one is there to reach out a hand and say, you're a trustee of this building, how can we help you?
You've alluded to your professional background a little bit and some of your working history, and which is why there's the interest in this.
Yeah.
How and why do you feel that it's perhaps slipped down the list of priorities, maybe?
Well, I can understand it. Of course, we had the big crash in the financial world, and then the Isle of Man had the VAT bomb drop on us, and of course, government have had to pull their horns in and be very prudent. So it's usually the nice to have things that go first.
So is this seen as like luxury expenditure almost for government?
I think in some eyes it is, but what I'd like to do is raise the awareness and the profile for across government and across our nation that this is very special. This is our island. This is what adds to the richness. And I actually think our younger generation, not just through social media, but that they're much more proactive, and there's that special Manx identity now that I find is much stronger than when I was growing up in the island. It's like the language. When I was growing up, it was something really that was pushed to one side, and I'd like to think the breadth of our built and cultural heritage is really a plus that will attract people to come and work and live here. And that's why I want government to really engage across our departments and get our heads together as to how we can actually address this in the future.
You're also asking the Minister for Policy and Reform about conservation areas. You've mentioned Douglas Head as a specific case study, and the question is linked to it as well. Tell us what a conservation area is and what protection that brings, if you could.
Yes. A conservation area, usually, it will look at a special character within a group of buildings. Some of them can be quite small. For instance, there's the Little Switzerland Conservation Area that homes in on the special qualities of the arts and crafts properties there. Now, the Douglas Promenade Conservation Area is that wonderful, that Venice of the North that Sir John Betjeman referred to, and that's mostly Victorian buildings, but it's the sweep and it's the views into and out of those areas. And now, there used to be grants to help you with windows, maybe with the right finishings for your roof, with painting your property, repairing roofs and stacks. That's all gone. So with a registered building, you used to be able to get assistance even with internal repairs. So it's the special quality and character of an area. Now, Douglas Head, you'll come in on the boat. What's the first thing you see is this wonderful headland which shines whether it's night or daytime. Now, I'm concerned the policy office is within the Cabinet Office. They have an awful lot going on at the moment. They've had the Eastern Area Plan, they've now got the Northern Area Plan calling for sites, etc. They need that dedicated and experienced, skilled person to have time as well to look at these area appraisals. I know there are some in the south that are in the Southern Area Plan that are proposed or emerging, but they've never been designated. Now, that's not fair, really, on people who live in these areas. Where are they? They're in a limbo, whereas they probably are taken cognizance of when an inspector is looking at planning appeals. So we really need to have some clarity on this, but in a proper manner and a professional manner.
you've mentioned the area plans. Would it be fair to say that government, in its priorities for this administration, is looking more at new builds and new buildings and new developments rather than protecting the existing built landscape?
I don't say this representing government, but I think what government has been seeking to do is to encourage people to invest in the built environment, whether that be new or in refurbishments or mixed use sites. But I think, again, one of the roles I had when I was conservation officer, because my background is architecture, I could actually have a conversation with people who were looking at developing a site that may benefit from an architect's input, but with my conservation qualifications as well. I could say, well, have you thought about it this way? And take these buildings as generators for ideas of design, and then approach the design of the site in an appropriate manner. Yeah, it's easier to build new builds. Of course it is. It's trickier to blend in and do something that's appropriate. But it's our island. We've got to be strong, and we've got to put those guidelines and put that advice in place. And I take that very seriously.
And where does the responsibility for doing that or trying to do that sit in government?
Well, it sits with the planning office, but because I am aware they've advertised again for a registered buildings officer and an assistant, and I understand appointments are hopefully very close. That officer, along with the planning officers, would be, I would say, the point of contact, which is great. But the policy is coming out of Cabinet Office. So I'm not sure whether that's the right place for policy. It's not up to me. But I can't actually sometimes see how the two are linking closely enough together. But I do say I have regular contact with the planning office through the Director of Planning, Jennifer Chance, whose door is open for a conversation. I talk to Manx National Heritage because they now, because of the restrictions on third-party input on planning applications, Manx National Heritage have been saddled with that the mantle of having input into planning applications or registered building applications. But I'm also aware that they are limited in their resources, because they haven't got that kind of resource allocated to them, really. So it's across government, but it really needs to be handled in a positive and encouraging way, but one that is objective and professional in the advice it can give.
We saw some of these discussions come to the fore in the case study of the old police station in Castletown when they were looking at the future
of that. The Bailey Scott building, the Pepper
example.
Pot, as I call it. It's a wonderful little building.
And the future of that building, we'll see. There were assertions at that time that perhaps registered status for buildings didn't provide as much protection as some people would like it to. Is that
right? There are a number of strains to that. There's first of all a perception. I know that I think it's not just a Manx perception, but I know for uninformed people, it can be thought that registration or listing, it's called in England and elsewhere, or conservation area status can actually have an impact on the value of a property. Now, I remember, I think the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors, I would think it would be about 15, 20 years ago, they did a major piece of work looking at that very matter. And the results that came back from that were that when it's initially listed or registered, there is a bit of a dip because people are becoming acquainted with what the nature of the beast is. But especially where there are grants available, there's then a feeling, this is good. And then there's a lift and it lifts, and the end result, maybe after 2 to 3 years, is that it could be worth as much as 15% more in terms of value. But that's when you go to areas, conservation areas already on the Isle of Man, where you just feel that little bit uplift in the quality and protection of where you are. I know, like around the Crofts in Castletown, areas of Peel where you wander around the back, and Queen Street and Charles Street, they're quite sought after places now. And people think, well, why is that? I think that is a trickle down effect of the conservation area status, and people buy properties in those areas because they do understand and they do see the value of that protection. You just can't have any development go on without that bit extra scrutiny. And so I do think there's an awful lot of positive stuff that really needs to be understood out there. Hence, in a way, me sitting here today to try and help that conversation.
And you're asking the Environment Minister how many buildings have been entered into the Protected Buildings Register since October 2016, so in this administration. And how many have been removed from the register and on what grounds. Maybe just generally, could you give us an idea of what some reasons might be for buildings being moved in or out of that register?
Well, first of all, there is what's called the Provisional Registered Buildings List, and that's got hundreds of buildings on it. And that's been in existence since the mid-80s, I think, where there was this almost like an invitation for sites. It was an invitation to the Manx community. Which buildings in your community do you think are worthy of protection? Now, that list has existed, and when I was working in that environment, I was steadily working through that list, and I commissioned quite a lot of research. I know there's over 100 files of research that I actually commissioned local architects and specialists to do, because I was one on my own. They are somewhere on file, and their value will not have been lost. So really, there are many buildings that need looking at. There's a lot of work to be done. I know when Ross was in post, he was steadily trying to address that, and the Building Conservation Forum and other friends were actually trying to help in that regard as well. But the Building Conservation Forum that I chair has got no resources. Our members come from all walks of life and different backgrounds. We do not have the core of resources that's needed to undertake such an audit. Now, I know Jersey, they started their audit in 2008, and I think it's just on the horizon of finishing that audit.
And yet, in theory, we've got a 10-month deadline.
Well,
in theory,
under the programme for government, I think December is the month when, I don't think it says start, it says buy. Now, I'm not trying to score points. I want to start this positive conversation because I know how much work is going to be needed to do a proper audit where you actually don't just write a building off by ticking a box. It's got to be meaningful and look at the buildings across our whole wardrobe, vernacular Victorian arts and crafts, and even maybe some modern buildings that might still need to be protected, that people maybe don't understand the value of. When you're brought up in this environment, sometimes what you pass every day, you don't realise what it is that's on your doorstep. So, I think there's an awful lot of positive stuff to come out of this. And, climate change, if we're not to lose buildings whole scale, we really need to have some joined up thinking as well, because these buildings have a lot to give.